In the middle of tremendous darkness and personal tragedy, false lights are trying to guide us, and they can bring shipwreck. We must be focused on God's pathways and His light in the storms of life. Christ is the light of navigation. Hello, and welcome to the Light of Navigation and the God Stories. My name is Marguerite Lever-Woodall, and I'm an author, speaker, and your host. I write short stories about real-life supernatural encounters with God, and I love to explore what it is, what it means to follow God's pathways. In this 23rd episode of the God Stories called God, the Buried Hatchet, and the Prison Break, I'll share about a powerful moment where God intervened on my behalf when I was in the painful prison of unforgiveness and I couldn't free myself. It was an intervention that was totally unexpected and remarkable. Come and join me in the adventures of the God Stories and experience the encounters with the goodness of God, even in the middle of our life's storms. There's a book published out there titled Forgiving What You Can't Forget. Some of us have had ugly things happen in our lives that others have inflicted on us, and I mean real ugly. Sometimes the treacheries seem endless that can come from someone, and it can run its course for years in some cases. There's been someone I've needed to forgive for quite some time. But what do you do when they've cut you off and any communication is not possible so you can reconcile? You know, it's that kind of person that when they write you off completely. Do you know anyone like that? There's obviously unforgiveness toward you on their end as well. So how can you reach out to them? What do you do when every phone call, letter, or card is ignored or thrown away unopened? It was during the lowest point of my life, the week I buried my son, when I discovered a betrayal of what felt like epic proportions. It was perpetrated by a relative on my former husband's side of the family. I stood on their front porch that evening, knocking on the door of their home to discuss the funeral arrangements for my son that I was making that week. It was a friend of the family who opened the door, and it was someone who didn't know me personally. After I introduced myself and they realized who I was, they quickly became hostile. What's going on, I thought. I was baffled and hurt by the spiteful reception, and so was my sister, who had accompanied me. I was confused and shocked at having been greeted with a palpable anger and disgust. The house was filled with several people gathered there after the news of my son's death had spread. It seemed like every young person in life that my son knew was there. As I made my way to the family dining room, I sensed a detachment from several of those present. Only a few of them knew me personally, but they distanced themselves as I approached. In short, I was being rejected and shoved aside relationally by my in-laws, my son's friends, his acquaintances, on top of the gut-wrenching grief I was going through. I began thinking to myself, how did it happen that the passing of my son had become more of a worsening nightmare than it already was? Over the course of the next few days, it was revealed that one of my family's relatives had been spreading falsehoods and assumptions about me for quite some time. My character, parenting skills, and Christian views had been called into question, even discredited in conversations in front of my son's friends and others. over several years. The fruit of the betrayal was on full display at the worst possible time that night. Honestly, it never occurred to me that this person would have been doing this. For some strange reason, I assumed they would not speak ill of me because of our kinship. This gives new definition to naivety, doesn't it? The truth is, I was not like-minded with them in many of life's arenas, morally or spiritually. Their perspective of me was not kind. When a breakdown had occurred in my life several years previously, my faith, my church, and my closest friends were blamed for it by this individual. Don't get me wrong. I've had setbacks in my life, like many do, of course, and some have been misunderstood. I haven't lived life perfectly either. Afterward, I was viewed as a kook and a religious nut because of my Christian faith. And at times, admittedly, there was my immature application of it. It was also inferred with others that I did not love my son because I'd moved out of state after he graduated high school. Randall had declined to move with me because he wanted to stay close to the many friends he had in the area. Of all the falsehoods that a person could endure, that one deeply devastated me as a mother. When my son became an addict years later and I had refused to enable his irresponsible actions, this family member saw the refusals to enable as a lack of love, rather than the truest definition of it. As a result, I was subtly vilified as a mother and parent in front of others when I was not present to defend myself. This character assassination had transpired over the course of at least 20 years, and I was clueless. Equally painful was the lack of anyone telling me about it. I was also somehow blamed for my former husband's accidental death. My husband was the love of my life, my best friend, and his sudden death devastated me. After my son's passing, this relative chose to write me off and refused any contact in the 8 years that followed. No phone calls would be taken, no letters or cards I sent were open. Instead, I was told they were thrown away immediately upon arrival. I wondered if I was the scapegoat for every hardship in their life, and the grief as well. I'm sharing this part of my past for an important reason. The result was a hardening of my heart towards this family member, and unforgiveness set in. I saw them as an enemy, and I couldn't shake the pain of the treachery every time I thought about it. As a Christian, I consciously chose to forgive whenever the hurt would overtake me. However, it just kept coming back over and over again like a bad penny. Regular prayer to forgive brought no release and freedom from my prison and its deep pain, and I didn't know the pathway out. What I was doing scripturally didn't seem to be working. I instinctively knew somehow that everything hinged on communication with this family member again, but how could I? I'd been written off. Over and over again, I prayed for God to make a way for me to truly forgive and reconcile. Suddenly, 8 years later, a third party contacted me, and I was told that this family member was requesting that I call them. I was shocked, knowing how they had cut me off with such finality before. A door had suddenly opened in what looked like an impossible situation before. They were in their 90s now, and I was informed that recent aging issues were possibly affecting their mental faculties. They described the relative's conversation with them as strange, Their description of it included the statement that it was as though a wall had come down in their life. The memories of the rift in our relationship no longer seemed to exist. History seemingly had suddenly rewritten itself with them toward me. And this was stunning to me, as I was certain this individual would die without any reconciliation occurring between us. Not knowing if the turn of events was temporary or permanent, I summoned all the courage I could to call one more time. There was a chance that I would be treated with a cold distance, or worse, verbally attacked if their memories suddenly shifted again. When I called that evening, the conversation was like entering the twilight zone. It was as though the relationship had never been tainted by any animosity, anger, rancor, or rumor in the course of the previous 8 years. I deeply sensed a divinely orchestrated opening in time by God for me to take a leap into the forgiveness needed on my part. The possible mental aging issue, brief or long term, had opened the door for forgiveness and reconciliation. The estranged family member began our conversation by telling me they had missed me terribly. In those moments, when I sensed that I was not written off, at least briefly, I jumped in with both feet. I quickly replied, "I want you to know how deeply I love you. And I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for all you did for my son and I over the years." As I said this, I was swept up emotionally with a God-filled and God-given love for them that was unlike anything I'd ever known before. It was a powerful moment, and it ran deep. A sudden, spontaneous movement of God's love, not mine, roared through my heart that I had not expected. Whether it was dementia, Alzheimer's, or a medical issue due to a new medication, I do not know. All I knew was that they hadn't forgotten me, but they had forgotten they'd written me off. It was a divinely timed opening for my freedom from unforgiveness, and to this day, I'm overwhelmed with a God-filled love for them, and I call them often. The seemingly impossible opportunity to voice forgiveness and reconciliation was presented by God despite it all, and it came through a strange memory lapse on the family member's part. He gave me the opportunity and conversation to step through at the right moment and the right time. I was emotionally healed immediately, and liberty came in those moments when I chose to voice the simple, deeply heartfelt words of God's inspired love and appreciation for them. I want to pause my story here to say this. In our Western part of the world, our understanding of forgiveness is a far cry from the Hebraic one. In the American church, we have instead learned to exercise a very cold, intellectual, verbal statement of forgiveness that has no life in it, and no evident release accompanies it. When genuine forgiveness exists, it is evident both mentally and emotionally. The mindset of the Hebrew people is very different than ours. In the act of forgiving, there's a deliberate emotional approach involved. They'll bring to mind the wrong or offense that occurred and allow themselves to feel the full impact of the painful emotions that come with it. It's in the middle of the depths of that pain that the deliberate choice to forgive is made. When forgiving others this way, it's genuine because you've allowed yourself to feel the deep hurt, and yet in the middle of it, forgive. Christ did the same. As he was being crucified and in the middle of the horrific, pain-filled event, he forgave. Compare that to the cold, emotionless, and intellectual statement of, "I forgive you." It is void of a true depth of emotional intent, which is what I had learned and tried to apply to no avail. I also believe that forgiving is not forgetting, as we've been taught in the Western mindset. After we forgive, we haven't taken on a literal memory lapse like dementia. You do remember the events if you choose to. However, they quietly become recalled as historical rather than personal, and the pain is gone when true forgiveness has prevailed. More importantly, the hurtful memories are filed away in the forgiven section, in the file cabinet of the heart, and never brought forward again for any future review. The offenses just don't matter anymore. That is what I believe forgetting in the biblical sense really means. If you've struggled with unforgiveness and can't seem to break free, ask God to pave the way. I guarantee you will be answered in a very special way. With the opportunity that God gave me in that phone conversation, I chose to voice heartfelt love and gratitude, in spite of the pain of the betrayal. The door of that prison cell of unforgiveness opened as God moved beautifully between us. Because of God's love that He gave me in those moments, the hatchet was buried, the jail cell emptied, and I'd made my prison break. Thank you so much for taking time to listen to my podcast. If this podcast can open a prison door of the heart for someone you know, please pass it on. Your comments are valued, and subscribing would also be appreciated. In the next episode of the God Stories, titled God and the Lion in the Streets, I'll share with you a direct word from the Lord. It was a word I was given on being unaware of the enemy of our souls who's prowling around out in the open and also in our lives. It's an episode you don't want to miss.